There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They were the camouflage of a Tuesday night, or the quiet hum of a refrigerator, or the weight of a friend's head in your lap. You don't recognize them as watershed moments at the time. They carry no banner, sound no alarm. It's only later, when you trace the map of your own heart, that you find the pin marking the exact spot where the entire landscape of your world tilted on its axis. For me, that moment smelled faintly of the sandalwood soap Alex used and felt like the impossibly heavy, impossibly warm pressure of his temple against my thigh. His breath is soft, rhythmic tied against the worn denim of my jeans. He was asleep, lost to a world I couldn't access, while I was more awake than I had ever been, cataloging the tectonic shift happening in the silent, blue-lit space of my living room. He had been my friend for 7 years, my best friend, my anchor, and for 6 of those years, I had been quietly, hopelessly, and comprehensively in love with him. It was a love I had learned to manage, to fold up and put away like a winter coat in the spring. I treated it as a chronic condition, a background hum that was simply part of my own internal weather system. It was mine to carry, and mine alone. Alex was a fixed point in the northern sky of my life, bright, constant, and impossibly distant. He was straight. He had girlfriends, a string of them, each one a painful, smiling reminder of the fundamental architecture of our friendship, a blueprint that had no room for the things I felt. I was the safe harbor, the steady confidant, the one he came to when the seas of his own life got choppy. And I had learned to be content with that role, because the alternative, a life without him in it at all, was unthinkable. But on this particular Tuesday, as the city breathed its exhaust-tinged sighs outside my window, and the only light came from a muted crime drama on the television, something was different. The lines of the blueprint had been smudged. The weight of his sleep, the complete and utter trust it implied, was a new kind of language, and I was terrified that I was translating it all wrong, letting my own desperate hope write a fiction that would ruin us both. His hair was a dark mess under my hesitant fingers, and I remember thinking, with a clarity that felt like a shard of glass in my chest, that this was it. This was the before. And whatever came next, even if it was just the quiet shuffling of him waking up and moving back to his side of the couch, would be the after. The world had already changed. He just didn't know it yet. We met in a place that felt, in retrospect, like a perfect metaphor for our entire relationship, a darkroom. It was a required course for my photography major, a sanctuary of chemical smells and the soft, magical glow of enlargers. For Alex, a kinesiology major with the sun-kissed ease of a lifelong athlete, it was a dreaded arts elective he was taking to fulfill a graduation requirement. He stumbled into that windowless space like a creature of the sun forced underground, all broad shoulders and restless energy, looking profoundly out of place amongst the pale, quiet art students. I remember the first time I really saw him. He was squinting at a contact sheet, his brow furrowed in a frustration so pure it was almost comical. He had no idea what he was looking at, and his roll of film, which he'd clumsily loaded in the changing bag, was a mess of overlapping exposures and light leaks. He looked up and caught my eye, a sheepish, disarming grin spreading across his face. "I think I broke photography," he'd said, his voice a low rumble that seemed too big for the quiet room. I'd found myself smiling back, a rare and surprising reflex. I was a creature of the darkroom, comfortable in the shadows, speaking the language of f-stops and developing times. He was all kinetic energy and bright, easy charm. We were opposing forces, yet something clicked into place between us. I showed him how to properly load the developing reel, my fingers brushing his in the complete, clumsy darkness of the changing bag. His hands, so adept at catching a football or swinging a bat, were comically inept with the delicate curl of film. There was an intimacy in that shared darkness, a vulnerability in his admission of incompetence and my quiet, patient guidance. That became our dynamic. I was the observer, the one who understood the nuances of light and shadow. He was the subject, the force of nature who moved through the world with an unthinking grace that I found endlessly captivating. I started taking photos of him, not for assignments, but for myself. Alex on the practice field, a study in motion and muscle. Alex laughing with his teammates, the sunlight catching in his hair. Alex asleep in the library, his textbook open on his chest, his face unguarded and soft. He was a natural subject, utterly unself-conscious, and my camera loved him. But I knew, even then, that it was not the camera. It was me. Our friendship solidified outside the darkroom, built on a foundation of late-night study sessions, cheap pizza, and the easy camaraderie that blossoms in the fertile ground of university life. He drew me out of my shell, pulling me into his orbit of pickup basketball games and boisterous parties where I would linger awkwardly in a corner until he found me and draped a comfortable arm around my shoulders, making me feel, for a moment, like I belonged. In return, I offered him a different kind of space. My quiet apartment became his refuge from the noise of his own life, a place where he could talk about the pressures of his scholarships, the complexities of his family, or the latest drama with his girlfriend, Sarah. I became the repository for his thoughts, the silent editor of his rough drafts of feelings. And I listened, always. I listened as he fell in love with her, my own heart a dull, aching drumbeat in my ears. I listened as he celebrated their anniversaries, as he planned their future, as he navigated their arguments. I learned the precise contours of their relationship, a geography I knew better than my own. The moment my affection curdled into something deeper, something undeniable, is seared into my memory like a double exposure. It was the autumn of our junior year. We were walking across campus, the air crisp with the smell of wood smoke and decaying leaves. A gust of wind kicked up a vortex of red and gold, and Alex, without thinking, threw his head back and laughed, a pure, unadulterated sound of joy. The low afternoon sun caught the gold flecks in his brown eyes, and for an instant, he was not just my friend. He was a composition of light and color and sound so perfect it made my chest ache. It was a physical blow, a sudden and profound understanding that the comfortable space I had built for my feelings was no longer large enough to contain them. It was love, not the friendly, brotherly kind I had been telling myself it was, but the consuming, terrifying, life-altering kind. And in that same instant, I knew I could never tell him. To tell him would be to shatter the beautiful, fragile thing we had built. It would be like exposing a roll of undeveloped film to the light. Everything would be lost in a flash of white. So I buried it. I built new walls, reinforced the old ones, and became a master architect of my own interior world, designing a life where my love for him could exist in a hidden room, a place he would never find. I became so good at it that I sometimes almost convinced myself it wasn't there. But it was always there, a quiet pilot light burning steadily in the dark. For years, this equilibrium held. He had Sarah, a kind and clever architecture student who I genuinely liked, which was its own special kind of torture. They were a good match, their energies complementing each other. She understood his drive, and he admired her creativity. I was their permanent third wheel, the stable, reliable Leo. I went to their parties, helped them move into their first off-campus apartment, and listened to them debate paint swatches. I photographed their life together, creating a beautiful archive of my own private heartbreak. They were a unit, a closed circuit, and I was the satellite, held in orbit by a gravitational pull I couldn't escape. I watched him love her, and I learned from it. I saw the way he would touch the small of her back when he guided her through a crowd, the way he would look at her when she was talking passionately about a project, the unconscious intimacy that defined their connection. I filed these observations away in that secret room, artifacts of a life I would never have. I told myself that being his friend, his closest friend, was more than enough. It had to be, and for a long time, it was. I had my photography, my own quiet life, and the steady, reassuring presence of Alex. The foundation was solid, the boundaries clear. We were Leo and Alex, best friends, and that was all we would ever be. I had made my peace with it, or so I thought. The shift began with a phone call on a rainy Thursday in November. It was late, after midnight, and the sound of my phone buzzing on the nightstand ripped me from a shallow sleep. It was Alex, but his voice was a choked, unrecognizable thing. He could barely form words, just fractured sounds of distress. Sarah had left him. It wasn't a fight, not a dramatic explosion, but a quiet, devastating conversation. She had been offered a dream job with a prestigious firm in another country, an opportunity she couldn't refuse. And he, tethered to his own career, his family, his entire life here, couldn't go with her. It was a slow, painful amputation, a decision born not of a lack of love, but of the brutal logistics of two lives moving in opposite directions. He said her name, just once, and the sound broke apart, dissolving into a raw, ragged sob that felt like it was being torn from the very center of his being. I told him to stay put, that I was coming over, but he was already on his way. "I can't be there," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I can't be in our apartment. It's full of her." When I opened my door, he looked like a shipwreck. He was soaked from the rain, his hair plastered to his forehead, his face pale and hollowed out. He was wearing a thin hoodie, completely inadequate for the weather, and he was shivering, though I suspected it was from shock more than cold. He didn't say anything. He just walked past me into the living room and collapsed onto my couch, folding in on himself like a building imploding. The vibrant, confident energy that was so essentially Alex was gone, replaced by a profound and terrifying emptiness. I had seen him disappointed. I had seen him angry. I had seen him stressed, but I had never seen him broken. It was like seeing a mountain crumble. I did the only things I knew how to do. I made him tea, which he held in his trembling hands, but didn't drink. I draped my warmest blanket over his shoulders. I sat on the floor by the couch, not touching him, just being a quiet, solid presence in the wreckage. He talked for hours, his voice a low, monotonous torrent of grief and confusion. He retraced their entire relationship, searching for cracks he'd missed, for signs that this was coming. He wasn't just mourning Sarah. He was mourning the future he had so carefully constructed in his mind. The house, the kids, the shared life that had been his blueprint for adulthood, it had all vanished. I listened, my heart aching for him, a painful counterpoint of sympathy and a deeply buried, shameful flicker of something else. Something I refused to name. My role was clear, to be the friend, the anchor. I kept my own complicated feelings locked away, bolting the door to that hidden room. This was about him, only him. Sometime before dawn, his words finally ran out. His body, exhausted by the emotional deluge, simply gave up. He slumped sideways on the couch, his cheek pressed against the worn corduroy cushion, and fell into a dead sleep. I watched him for a long time, his face in the gray pre-dawn light looking younger, more vulnerable than I had ever seen it. I carefully took the cold mug of tea from his loosened grip and pulled the blanket up to his chin. It was the first time he had ever stayed the night. A boundary had been crossed, not by choice or desire, but by the sheer force of necessity. It was a crisis, an anomaly. That's what I told myself as I finally went to my own bed. The sound of his ragged breathing from the other room a new, unsettling rhythm in the familiar silence of my apartment. That first night bled into a weekend, and the weekend bled into a week. Alex didn't go back to his apartment except to grab clothes. He said the silence there was too loud, each object a screaming reminder of Sarah's absence. My place, he said, was neutral territory. It was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was a healing quiet. So he stayed. The couch became his bed, his laptop a permanent fixture on my coffee table as he tried to lose himself in the familiar logic of his coding work. Our lives, once parallel, had now merged. I learned the rhythms of his grief. I learned that he couldn't sleep through the night, that he would often wake up from dreams of her and just sit in the dark, staring at the wall. I learned that he had no appetite, and I started cooking simple, comforting meals that he would pick at, more to appease me than from any real hunger. We fell into a strange, domestic routine. I would wake up early for my freelance work, editing photos in the quiet of the morning, and find him already awake on the couch, a ghost illuminated by the blue glow of his phone screen. We would drink coffee in a silence that was heavy with everything he couldn't say. This was the beginning of the ritual, though I didn't recognize it as such at the time. It began with the couch. The couch was a safe, platonic space. It was a clear demarcation. I was in my room, in my bed, and he was out there, a guest seeking temporary refuge. The first few weeks, this boundary was rigid. I would say goodnight and close my bedroom door, leaving him to the solitude of the living room. It felt right, respectful of the unspoken lines of our friendship. But the nights were the worst for him. The darkness seemed to amplify his loneliness, leaving him adrift on a sea of memory and regret. One night, about a month into his stay, I was reading in bed when I heard a soft knock. It was so tentative I almost thought I'd imagined it. I opened the door to find Alex standing there, looking like a lost child. He clutched the blanket I'd given him around his shoulders. His eyes were wide and haunted. "I had a nightmare," he said, his voice barely a whisper. It's so quiet out there. It feels like the whole world is empty." He looked past me, into my room, then quickly looked away, as if he'd overstepped. "Sorry, this is stupid. I'll go back, wait," I said, my own heart rate kicking up. What if I leave my door open? The words were out of my mouth before I could properly analyze them. It felt like a compromise, a small concession to his pain that didn't completely demolish the architecture of our arrangement. A small smile of relief flickered on his lips. "Yeah? You wouldn't mind?" I shook my head. "No, of course not." I left the door ajar, a 6-inch gap that felt like a gaping canyon. I got back into bed and turned off the light, my body rigid. I was hyper-aware of that slice of hallway, the sliver of dim light it admitted into my dark room. It was a connection, a tether between his space and mine. I could hear him settle back onto the couch. I could hear the soft sigh he let out. And for the first time in weeks, the silence from the living room didn't feel like an absence. It felt like a presence. The open door became the new normal. It was an unspoken agreement, a nightly ritual. He never had to ask again. I would just leave it ajar when I went to bed, a silent acknowledgement of his need for connection, for the simple reassurance that he was not entirely alone in the dark. I told myself it was an act of friendship, a simple kindness. But I would lie awake for hours, staring at that strip of light, my imagination painting 1,000 scenarios in the space between our two rooms. The door was a metaphor, a physical representation of the boundary between us, and I had been the one to push it open. The ritual escalated on a night of freezing rain. A storm had blown in, rattling the windows and encasing the city in a shell of ice. The power had flickered a few times, adding a layer of primal anxiety to the already somber mood. Alex had been particularly restless all evening, pacing the apartment, unable to settle. The storm seemed to be mirroring his own internal turmoil. Around 2 in the morning, I woke to a sound, not a knock this time, but a soft creak of my door being pushed open a little wider. I lay perfectly still, my breath caught in my throat. In the dim light from the street lamp outside my window, I saw his silhouette filling the doorway. He just stood there for a long moment, a dark, uncertain shape against the fainter darkness of the hall. "Leo," he whispered, his voice tentative. "Are you awake?" My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. "I am now," I said, my own voice rough with sleep. "What's wrong?" He took a hesitant step into the room. "I'm sorry to wake you. It's the storm. And everything. I can't stop thinking." He gestured vaguely back toward the living room. "I feel like I'm going to crawl out of my skin out there." He looked at the small patch of empty floor beside my bed. "Do you think, would it be weird if I just sat in here for a bit? On the floor. I won't bother you. I don't want to be alone." Every rational thought in my head screamed at me to say no, to gently but firmly re-establish the boundary. This was a new threshold, a significant escalation. But looking at his shadowed form, at the palpable aura of desperation clinging to him, I couldn't do it. The part of me that loved him, the part that would do anything to ease his suffering, won out over the part that was terrified of the consequences. "Okay," I whispered. "It's okay." He slid down the wall to sit on the floor, his back against it, his knees drawn up to his chest. He was only a few feet from my bed, but the proximity was electric. I could feel the heat radiating from him. I could smell the faint, clean scent of his skin. We sat in silence for a long time, The only sounds the drumming of the icy rain against the glass and the soft, uneven rhythm of his breathing. I didn't sleep. I lay on my side, facing him, watching the way the shadows moved across his form. He had crossed the threshold. He was inside my room, my sanctuary, the one place I had allowed myself to be unguarded. The air was thick with unspoken things, with his grief and my years of silent yearning. It was a dangerous, fragile truce, and I had no idea what the rules of engagement were. The final wall came down a week later. It was not a storm that broke it, but a simple, mundane complaint. "It's freezing out there," Alex mumbled one evening as he arranged the cushions on the couch. "This apartment has a draft, you know that." I knew it was an excuse. My heating was fine, but I also knew it was a test, a question disguised as a statement. He was gauging my reaction, seeing how far he could push the new boundaries we were navigating. The old Leo, the cautious architect of our friendship, would have offered him another blanket. But the old Leo had been eroded by weeks of shared silence and open doors. The new Leo, the one who was drowning in a mixture of hope and fear, heard himself say, "My bed's big enough for two." The words hung in the air between us, shimmering with possibility and peril. Alex looked at me, his expression unreadable. I saw a flicker of surprise, then something else, relief. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice low. "I don't want to I knew." He didn't want to make it weird. He didn't want to imply anything. He needed the plausible deniability. "It's fine," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Just stay on your side." That first night was an exercise in exquisite torture. He got into bed, careful to keep a wide, deliberate channel of empty space between us. But the sheer fact of him being there, in my bed, was overwhelming. My senses were on high alert. I was aware of the dip his weight made in the mattress, the sound of his breathing, deep and close. The air felt charged, each molecule vibrating with a silent tension. I lay on my back, staring at the ceiling, my entire body rigid, terrified of making a single move that could be misinterpreted. After what felt like an eternity, he spoke into the darkness. "Thanks, Leo." Really, his voice was soft, laced with a genuine gratitude that made my heart ache. "It's okay," I whispered back. "Get some sleep." Eventually, his breathing evened out, deepening into the slow, steady rhythm of sleep. But I remained awake for hours, a sentry guarding a border that had already been breached. This became the new, unspoken ritual. The couch was abandoned. Every night, he would slip into my bed, and we would lie there in the dark, separated by a chasm of unspoken feelings and careful distance. But the chasm began to shrink. It happened incrementally, in shifts so small I thought I might be imagining them. A night when he turned in his sleep and his knee brushed against mine. A morning when I woke up to find his hand resting on the pillow, inches from my face. The physical space between us was contracting, slowly, almost imperceptibly, as if drawn together by its own gravitational pull. The biggest shift came one night when he was in the throes of a nightmare. He made a soft, distressed sound, and his body jolted. Before I could even think, I reached out and put a hand on his shoulder. "Alex," I said softly, "you're okay. You're dreaming." He didn't wake up, but he quieted. He turned toward me, still asleep, and in a completely unconscious gesture, he threw an arm across my chest, his head coming to rest in the hollow of my shoulder. And he stilled. His breathing deepened, and he settled into a peaceful sleep, anchored to me. I froze. My entire world narrowed to the point of contact. The heavy, warm weight of his arm, the soft brush of his hair against my chin, the heat of his breath on my neck. I should have moved. I should have gently disentangled myself and restored the buffer zone. It was the sensible, self-protective thing to do. But I couldn't. It felt too right. It felt like coming home to a place I had only ever dreamed of visiting. So I lay there, motionless, for the rest of the night, my heart beating a frantic, joyous, terrified rhythm against his arm, a prisoner of my own deepest desire. This, too, became part of the ritual. He would start the night on his side, but by morning, we would be tangled together, his unconscious need for comfort overriding the careful boundaries we'd set. And I, in the silent hours of the night, would allow myself to pretend that it meant something more. The tension that had been building for weeks, for months, finally reached its breaking point on a quiet Monday night. There was nothing remarkable about the evening. We had eaten dinner, watched a movie, and fallen into the familiar pattern of our nightly ritual. We were in bed, lying on our sides, facing each other in the dim light. The space between us was barely a hand's breadth, but it felt like a supercharged vacuum, pulling everything into it. His eyes were open, and he was watching me with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. The usual mask of grief and exhaustion was gone, replaced by something else, something raw and uncertain that I had never seen in him before. The air was thick with the weight of every conversation we hadn't had, every touch that had lingered a second too long, every shared silence that had been filled with unspoken questions. The quiet hum of the apartment felt like a roar in my ears. I could feel my own pulse in my throat, a frantic, fluttering bird. I wanted to speak, to say something, anything, to break the spell, but my throat was closed, my words trapped behind a wall of fear. I was terrified of what he might say, and even more terrified of what he wouldn't. He was the one who broke the silence. His voice, when it came, was a rough, quiet thing, barely more than a breath in the stillness of the room. "Leo," I managed a sound of affirmation, a small noise that felt wholly inadequate. He didn't speak again for a long moment, his gaze searching mine, as if he were looking for a map, for directions through this uncharted territory we had found ourselves in. I could see the conflict in his eyes, the war between years of self-perception and this new, confusing reality. He swallowed, the sound loud in the quiet room. "I can't sleep," he whispered. It was the most obvious statement in the world, yet it felt laden with 100 other meanings. "Are you awake?" I held his gaze, trying to communicate everything I couldn't say with my eyes alone. The years of affection, the depth of my patience, the sincerity of my care. "I'm awake," I said, my voice as quiet as his. We just lay there, breathing each other's air, caught in a moment that felt suspended in time. The entire history of our friendship, and the potential future of it, seemed to be balanced on the knife's edge of this single, silent exchange. Then, he closed his eyes for a second, as if gathering a final, monumental ounce of courage. When he opened them again, the uncertainty was still there, but it was underpinned by a new, fragile resolve. He moved his hand, the one that had been resting on the pillow between us, and his fingers brushed against mine. The contact was a jolt of electricity, a spark in the volatile air. His voice was trembling slightly when he spoke, the words so vulnerable it felt like I was holding his heart in my hands. Would it be okay if I kissed you?" The world stopped. The frantic bird in my throat went still. The roaring in my ears fell silent. All that existed was his question, hanging in the space between us like a fragile, perfect sphere of hand-blown glass. It was a question that offered me an escape route, a way to say no, to preserve the safety of our friendship, to retreat to the known world. But I didn't want the known world anymore. I wanted this one, the one where Alex, my Alex, was looking at me with terrified hope in his eyes. I couldn't form a word. The emotion was too immense, a wave that crested and crashed over me, leaving me speechless. So I just nodded, a small, jerky movement. It was enough. He closed the small distance between us, his movements slow, tentative, giving me every opportunity to pull away. His other hand came up to cup my jaw, his thumb stroking my skin, a gesture of such profound tenderness it almost broke me. And then his lips met mine. It wasn't a kiss of passion or demand. It was a question. It was a confession. It was soft and uncertain and deeply, achingly gentle. It tasted of fear and relief in the quiet, stunning revelation of a truth that had been hiding in plain sight all along. It was the sound of a door, one I thought was permanently locked, finally swinging open. The morning after was a landscape of brutal, clanging silence. I woke up first, to the soft gray light of dawn filtering through the blinds. Alex was still asleep, turned away from me, a rigid line of back that felt like a fortress wall. The warmth and vulnerability of the night before had vanished, replaced by a cold, unfamiliar distance. I lay there, replaying the kiss in my mind, a desperate attempt to recapture the feeling of rightness, of revelation. But in the harsh light of day, it felt fragile, dreamlike, and profoundly dangerous. When he finally stirred, he didn't turn to me. He sat up quickly, running a hand through his already messy hair, his movements jerky and avoidant. He wouldn't meet my eyes. The intimacy of the night had evaporated, leaving a vacuum of awkwardness in its place. I have to get to work early, he mumbled, his voice gravelly. He pulled on his clothes with a frantic energy, a man escaping the scene of a crime. I sat up in bed, the sheets pulled around my waist, feeling exposed and suddenly cold. I wanted to say his name, to ask him to look at me, to talk about what had happened. But the words wouldn't come. I was paralyzed by the fear of his answer. He was at the door, his hand on the knob, his back still to me. He paused for a beat, and for a wild, hopeful second, I thought he was going to turn around. I thought he would come back to the bed, that he would smile and kiss me again, and the morning would be saved. Instead, he spoke to the door, his voice flat and remote. Look, about last night. My heart plummeted. It doesn't have to mean anything. Okay, it was just a weird night. We're still us. Leo and Alex. Nothing has to change, and then he was gone. The door clicked shut behind him, the sound echoing in the silent apartment like a gunshot. I stared at the closed door, at the space where he had been, and felt a profound, hollowing emptiness. Nothing has to change. The words were a negation, a denial, a desperate attempt to put the world back on its old axis after it had been so fundamentally tilted. But it was too late. For me, everything had changed. The hope that had bloomed in the darkness of the night shriveled and died in the stark, unforgiving light of morning. He hadn't been opening a door. He had been checking to see if it was locked. And finding it open, he had panicked and slammed it shut, leaving me on the other side, alone. I felt like a fool, a naive, hopeful idiot who had mistaken a moment of lonely confusion for a confession of love. The beautiful, honest silence we had built was gone, replaced by this new, jagged one, sharp with regret and misunderstanding. The days that followed were a special kind of hell. Alex didn't come back. He sent a single, terse text message that evening. Gonna stay at my place for a bit. Need to sort some stuff out. The open-endedness of it was a form of torture. He didn't say he was moving out. He didn't say he was ending our friendship. He just disappeared into a fog of ambiguity. The apartment, which had felt so full with his presence, was now cavernous in its emptiness. The indentation his head had left on the couch cushion, the mug he'd left by the sink, the faint scent of his soap that lingered in my bathroom. They were all ghosts, painful reminders of the intimacy I had so briefly been allowed. I tried to go back to my old routine, but it was impossible. The silence I had once found comforting was now oppressive. I would find myself leaving my bedroom door ajar out of habit, only to be struck by a fresh wave of grief at the empty hallway beyond. I had allowed myself to hope, and the recoil was brutal. My carefully constructed walls were in ruins, and I felt raw, exposed, and deeply, deeply hurt. I replayed his words over and over. Nothing has to change. It was a promise meant to be reassuring, but it felt like a sentence. It meant we had to go back to pretending, back to the old blueprint. But I didn't know how. I had seen what could be in that other room, and I couldn't unsee it. After a week of suffocating silence, broken only by a few stilted, one-word text exchanges, I couldn't take it anymore. The not knowing was worse than any potential truth. The anger and hurt had simmered down into a dull, heavy ache, and beneath it, a desperate need for clarity. I drove to his apartment, my hands slick on the steering wheel, my stomach a knot of anxiety. I didn't have a plan. I just knew that the silence had to end. When he opened the door, he looked almost as wrecked as I felt. There were dark circles under his eyes, and he looked like he hadn't been sleeping. Surprise flickered across his face, followed quickly by a guarded, wary expression. "Hey," he said, his voice hesitant. He didn't invite me in. He just stood there, partially blocking the doorway. "Can I come in?" I asked, my voice firmer than I expected. He hesitated for a second, then stepped back, letting me pass. His apartment was a mess. Boxes of Sarah's things were half-packed in a corner, a project started and then abandoned. Takeout containers littered the coffee table. The air was stale and sad. It was the home of a man adrift. We stood in the middle of his living room, a few feet apart, the silence stretching between us, taut and uncomfortable. I was the one who finally broke it. "We need to talk about this, Alex." He flinched at my directness, shoving his hands in his pockets and staring at the floor. "There's nothing to talk about," he mumbled. "I told you it's fine. Nothing changed, that was it." That was the phrase that finally broke through my fear. A hot surge of frustration washed over me. "Stop saying that," I said, my voice rising. "Stop saying nothing has to change, because it's a lie. Everything changed. You can't come into my home, into my room, into my bed, and kiss me like that, and then pretend it was nothing. It wasn't nothing to me." I took a breath, my chest tight. "You opened a door, Alex. You can't just slam it shut and act like I didn't see what was on the other side. That's cruel. And you are not a cruel person. So you have to tell me. What was that? For you. I need to know the truth." My words hung in the air, a direct challenge he couldn't deflect. He finally looked at me, and his eyes were filled with a terrifying mix of panic and pain. He looked trapped. He paced the small space between the couch and the television, his movements agitated, like a caged animal. "I don't know," he said, the words tearing out of him. "Okay, I don't know what it was. I don't know what's happening." He stopped and faced me, his hands gripping the back of his neck. "After Sarah left, I was completely lost. It felt like my whole world fell apart. And you were the only thing that was solid. The only thing that felt safe." His voice dropped, became quieter, more confessional. "Being at your place, it was the only time I could breathe. And then, I don't know when it started, but it started to change. Being near you wasn't just safe anymore. It was necessary. I needed it. I needed to be close to you." He looked at me, his expression pleading, as if begging me to understand something he couldn't articulate himself. "That night, when I kissed you, it was the first time in months that I felt something other than just empty. It felt right. And that scared the hell out of me." He finally collapsed onto his couch, burying his face in his hands. His shoulders shook. "My whole life," he said, his voice muffled, "I've been one thing. I'm the athlete, the guy with the girlfriend, the straight guy. That's the person I know how to be." And that kiss, it felt like the ground disappeared from under my feet. It felt like I didn't know who I was anymore. And I panicked. He looked up at me, his eyes red-rimmed and filled with a desperate, heartbreaking honesty. I said nothing had to change because I was terrified that everything already had. I ran away because I didn't know how to be this new person. I didn't know how to be the guy who was in love with his best friend. The last 5 words were a whisper, a secret finally spoken aloud, and they landed in the quiet room with the force of a physical blow. He had said it. He had finally said it. The relief was so profound it made my knees feel weak. All the anger, all the hurt, it just dissolved, washed away by the raw, painful truth of his confession. He was just as lost, just as terrified as I was. We were both standing in the wreckage, trying to figure out how to build something new. I crossed the room and sat down beside him on the couch, leaving a small, respectful space between us. And for the first time in a week, we were back in a silence that felt honest. That conversation was the foundation for our new world. It was painful and messy, but it was honest. There were no more hidden rooms, no more doors left ambiguously ajar. Everything was out in the open, raw and exposed. And from that vulnerable place, we began, carefully, to rebuild. We agreed to take it slow, a decision born of his fear and my deep-seated need for caution. The labels could wait. The future could wait. All that mattered was navigating the present, together. He started staying at my place again, but this time, it was different. There were no more pretexts, no more plausible deniability. He didn't sleep on the couch. He came to my room, to my bed, because that's where he wanted to be. The first night after our talk was tentative. We lay side by side, the way we used to, but the space between us was no longer a chasm of anxiety. It was a space of quiet respect, of mutual understanding. Sometime in the night, I felt his hand search for mine under the covers. His fingers intertwined with mine, a simple, solid gesture of connection. It wasn't a desperate, unconscious grab for comfort. It was a choice. I held his hand, and we fell asleep like that, anchored to each other in the dark. Our days began to find a new rhythm, one defined by an intentional, quiet intimacy. The grand, terrifying questions about our future were set aside in favor of small, concrete moments of togetherness. It was in the way he would bring me a cup of coffee in the morning, remembering exactly how I liked it. It was in the way I would put a hand on his back when I walked past him in the kitchen. It was in the shared smiles over a stupid television show, smiles that now held a deeper, shared meaning. We were learning a new language, one spoken not in grand declarations, but in 1,000 tiny gestures of care. He talked more about his confusion, his fear of what people would think, of how this would change his life. And I listened, not just as his friend, but as someone who was navigating this new landscape with him. I told him about my own years of silence, about the hidden room where I had kept my feelings for him. Sharing that history, making him understand that my feelings were not a reaction to his crisis, but a long-standing, patient truth, seemed to ease something in him. It made him feel less like he was falling, and more like he was finally being caught. Slowly, the haunted look in his eyes began to recede, replaced by a quiet calm I had never seen in him before. The restless energy that had always defined him seemed to settle. He was still Alex, still loved loud music and bad action movies, still left his socks on the floor, but there was a new stillness to him, a sense of having arrived somewhere he didn't even know he was looking for. We found our way back to physical intimacy not through a sudden burst of passion, but through a gradual, gentle exploration. It started with holding hands, then with him resting his head in my lap while we watched a movie, a conscious, deliberate echo of the night it all began. But this time, when my hand went to his hair, it wasn't a hesitant, fearful touch. It was a caress, open and affectionate. He leaned into it, his eyes closing in contentment. The kisses came back, not with the fraught, uncertain energy of the first one, but with a growing confidence and warmth. They were slow, tender things, full of discovery, as if we were relearning each other, mapping the new contours of our relationship one gentle touch at a time. The final piece of the old world fell away about a month later. He spent a weekend at his old apartment, methodically and finally packing up the last of Sarah's belongings and sorting through his own. It was something he had to do alone. I waited, my anxiety a low hum in the background, giving him the space he needed. He came back to my apartment late on Sunday night, carrying 2 duffel bags and a cardboard box filled with his books. He dropped them by the door and looked at me, his face tired but clear. "My lease is up at the end of the month," he said, his voice steady. "I'm not going to renew it." It wasn't a question, but I answered it anyway. "Okay," I said, my heart swelling. He walked over to me and wrapped his arms around me, pulling me into a hug that was solid and sure. He buried his face in my neck, and I held him tightly. There were no more ghosts in the room. There was just us. The door to my apartment was now the door to our apartment. It was closed not to hide us away from the world, but to create a space that was entirely our own, a home we were building together, piece by piece. Now, when I wake in the morning, it is to the sight of him beside me, his face soft in the early light, his arm thrown possessively across my waist. The rituals we have now are born not of need and confusion, but of love and choice. The quiet rhythm of making coffee together in the kitchen, his hand finding mine as we wait for the pot to brew. The comfortable silence as we read in the evenings, his feet resting on my lap. The way he turns to me in the middle of the night, pulling me closer, a silent, sleepy reassurance that I am there. We are still Leo and Alex, but we are a new iteration, a version of ourselves that has been tested and reforged. The friendship that was our foundation is still there, stronger than ever, but now it is the base for something more expansive, more beautiful. The quiet observer and the unknowing initiator have finally found a shared language, a way of being that requires no translation. There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary, and you don't recognize them until much later. But there are other moments, rarer and more precious, that are so clear, so resonant, you know their significance even as you are living them. Waking up to the warmth of Alex beside me, seeing the quiet peace on his face, feeling the steady beat of his heart against my back. These are those moments. They are the quiet affirmations that the terrifying, uncertain journey was worth it. We learned that a home is not always a place with four walls and a roof. Sometimes, it is the space you create with another person. It is a sanctuary built of trust and vulnerability, with a door you can close on the rest of the world, not out of fear, but because everything you could ever need is already inside. We began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we'd learned to create together.